He thought she was just another gold digger in first class, until he found out who she really was. The first-class cabin carried the unmistakable scent of luxury: polished leather, crisp suits, and expensive perfume. Soft murmurs filled the air, punctuated by the delicate chime of champagne glasses. Overhead bins snapped shut as passengers settled in, adjusting designer handbags and flashing high-end watches. Nathan Kessler barely lifted his eyes from his phone as he slid into seat 3A, his preferred window seat. He radiated the confidence of a man accustomed to closed-door deals and boardroom laughs, the kind that came even when his jokes weren't funny. Without hesitation, he ordered a scotch before takeoff, loosening his tie just enough to send a silent message he belonged here. The flight from Dallas to Tampa was a short one, just under 3 hours. Not long, but long enough to indulge in first-class perks. Work could wait. For now, he had premium drinks and the perfect vantage point to survey the cabin. That's when he noticed her. A blonde woman sat a few rows ahead, partially turned away, her fingers effortlessly scrolling through an iPad. There was something about her, something familiar but not quite enough for him to place. Maybe a local news anchor, a washed-up actress. Someone who'd had her 15 minutes and was desperately clinging to the last few seconds. He smirked, nudging the man beside him, a reserved-looking traveler who'd clearly drawn the short straw sitting next to someone who loved the sound of his own voice. Ever notice how some people think money can buy class? Nathan mused, just loud enough for nearby passengers to hear. The man beside him let out a polite but uninterested chuckle, eyes fixed on his in-flight magazine. Nathan didn't need encouragement to keep going. "She looks familiar," he continued, tilting his head slightly. "Probably some reality TV reject. You know the type. Big hair, overpriced handbag, and no clue how to blend in." His words drifted through the cabin, catching the ears of those nearby. A few passengers glanced his way, but the woman remained absorbed in her screen, giving no indication that she'd heard him, or that she cared. That didn't sit well with him. People like her were supposed to care what men like him thought. As the plane taxied down the runway, the flight attendant made her final rounds, checking seatbelts and collecting empty glasses. Nathan leaned back, stretching slightly, already bored before the flight had even taken off. He watched as the blonde woman handed off her drink with effortless grace, offering a polite smile to the attendant. Her posture was poised, her expression unreadable. It irritated him. There was something about the way she carried herself, an air of quiet confidence that suggested she wasn't easily rattled by side eyes or snide remarks. That only made him double down. "She must have married well," he muttered, shaking his head as if the thought amused him. "Third husband, maybe fourth? Probably has a plastic surgeon on speed dial. Same story, different name." This time the shift in the cabin was undeniable. The businessman across the aisle shot him a brief but pointed glance. The flight attendant hesitated ever so slightly as she moved past. Even the man next to him exhaled quietly, as if wishing he were anywhere else. Nathan, of course, either didn't notice or didn't care. As the plane lifted into the sky, he reached for his scotch, tapping his fingers against the glass. 3 hours. Plenty of time to entertain himself. What he didn't realize, this time the entertainment would come at his own expense. If he'd been at a bar instead of first class, he might have ordered another round for the whole table just to keep the game going. Instead, he settled for another scotch. "One more," he said, handing over his empty glass. Then, just because he could, he nodded toward the blonde woman. "And whatever she's having, on me." It was a test, a way to provoke a reaction. Maybe she'd laugh, shake her head, play along for a bit. Women like her loved attention. Or at least that's what he assumed. But the flight attendant didn't even hesitate. "She's fine, sir," she replied smoothly, taking his glass and walking away before he could say anything else. Nathan chuckled under his breath, shaking his head. So, she was one of those. The kind of woman who carried herself like she was above it all. Too good for a little conversation. Too important to acknowledge someone like him. He turned back to his seatmate, who had strategically cracked open a book, the universal signal for, "Please don't talk to me." "You ever notice that?" Nathan said, tapping the armrest between them. "How some people walk around like they're the main character in life? Like the rest of us are just extras in their little movie?" The man gave him a quick glance before returning to his book. "Haven't really thought about it." Nathan grinned, undeterred. "I'll tell you exactly who she is," he continued, keeping his voice at that perfect volume. Not quite loud enough to be rude, but just enough to make sure people around him could hear. "She's the kind of woman who gets by on her last name. On favors. Some senator's ex-wife, maybe. Or one of those lawyers who loves the camera but couldn't win a case to save her life." He let the words hang in the air, waiting for a reaction. A flicker of annoyance, a shift in posture, anything to let him know he was getting under her skin. Nothing. The blonde woman remained poised, scrolling through her tablet like he didn't exist, like he wasn't even there. Nathan exhaled sharply through his nose, adjusting his watch with irritation. "This isn't even fun anymore," he muttered. "Not even a glance." He shook his head. "Guess she's too important for the rest of us." A few rows back, a woman in a navy pantsuit exchanged a knowing glance with her seatmate. Across the aisle, an older man briefly looked up from his newspaper, one brow slightly raised. People were noticing him now. But Nathan, in his arrogance, assumed they were on his side, that they found her just as ridiculous as he did. And that was all the encouragement he needed. He leaned forward, resting his elbow on the armrest, lowering his voice just slightly, like he was letting his seatmate in on some great revelation. "Mark my words," he smirked. "She's gonna post something later about how exhausting travel is, probably complain about manspreading or some nonsense. Women like her love playing the victim." "Excuse me, sir." The voice was calm, firm. Nathan turned, expecting the flight attendant again. Instead, he found himself looking directly at her. For the first time, the blonde woman had turned fully toward him. Her expression, unreadable. No irritation, no anger. Just a look. A quiet, measured look that made Nathan suddenly aware of just how much his voice had been carrying. For the first time in a long time, he felt something strange, something unfamiliar. Discomfort. He shook it off, meeting her gaze, waiting for her to say something, to scold him, argue, do something that would justify his behavior. But she didn't. She just studied him for a moment. Then, with the faintest, most unreadable smile, she turned back to her tablet, like he wasn't even worth the effort. Nathan shifted in his seat, adjusting his cufflink, as if that could smooth over the unease creeping into his chest. That look she had given him, it wasn't dismissive, it wasn't irritated, it was worse, it was knowing, like she'd seen 100 men just like him before, and had already decided he wasn't worth a second thought. That should have made it easier to brush off, to roll his eyes and go back to his scotch, but it didn't. Instead, it ate at him. The flight attendant returned with his drink, setting it down with a polite nod before moving on. No lingering attention, no small talk, no warmth. Had she heard him too? Nathan took a slow sip, letting the ice clink against the glass. And, for the first time, the silence around him felt louder than anything he had said. Nathan swirled the ice in his glass, letting his gaze drift back to the woman. Pam. He reminded himself of the name, but something about it nagged at him, like an itch he couldn't quite reach. He still didn't know exactly who she was, but there was something familiar, a recognition just out of reach. She was still reading, still unbothered. But now that she had acknowledged him once, an invisible line had been drawn between them, a silent dare. And Nathan didn't do well with Doris. This time he spoke directly to her, keeping his tone casual, low enough to seem offhand but loud enough for those nearby to catch snippets. "Pam, is it? You don't look like a Pam." No response. A flicker of something twisted in his stomach, but he pushed forward. "I mean, no offense," he added with a small chuckle. You just seem more like a Kelly. Or a Lauren. He shook his head, smirking. Pam sounds like someone's mom. Still nothing. Nathan shifted in his seat, the weight of the silence pressing down on him. She wasn't just ignoring him anymore, she was letting him embarrass himself. Across the aisle, the older gentleman had returned to his newspaper, but Nathan had caught the way he'd glanced up earlier. Judging. 2 rows ahead, a younger man in a suit was pretending to type on his laptop. But Nathan knew the game. He was listening. Even the flight attendant moving past with a tray was keeping an eye on him out of the corner of her vision. The realization made Nathan's stomach tighten. They weren't laughing with him. He exhaled sharply through his nose, leaning back in his seat. Fine. Let them judge. People were so uptight these days, acting like a little light-hearted teasing was some kind of personal attack. It wasn't like he'd said anything that bad. He tossed back the rest of his scotch, setting the glass down with a little too much force. And then, as if the universe had been waiting for the perfect moment, the flight attendant spoke. "Miss Bondi, would you like another beverage?" At first, Nathan barely registered the words. Then the blonde woman, Pam, looked up and politely declined. And suddenly, everything clicked. Bondi. Pam Bondi. His entire body tensed, fingers curling around the armrest. Now it made sense. Former Attorney General of Florida, nationally known, politically connected, a legal bulldog who had taken on some of the most powerful people in the country. A woman who, oh God, wasn't just familiar because she'd been on television. She'd been on television because she was the kind of woman who could ruin a person's life with a single phone call. Nathan's throat went dry. He risked another glance at her, but she wasn't looking at him. She didn't need to. She already knew. And now, so did he. For the first time in the entire flight, Nathan had nothing to say. His mind scrambled for an escape hatch, but there was none. Pam Bondi. The name echoed in his head, each syllable unraveling his confidence thread by thread. His grip on the armrest tightened. How had he not recognized her sooner? Of course he'd seen her before. On news broadcasts, at press conferences, in courtroom footage aired on every major network. She had gone toe-to-toe with corporations, tangled with politicians, and won. And now he was sitting just a few feet away from her, realizing that all of his smug, whispered remarks had landed in the absolute worst place possible. The blood drained from his face. He glanced around the cabin, suddenly hyper-aware of just how many people had been within earshot. The older gentleman, the business traveler, the flight attendant who had heard everything. Had he just mocked a former attorney general in front of an entire first-class cabin? Nathan cleared his throat, shifting uncomfortably. He had to fix this. Turning slightly toward her, he forced a smile that felt stiff at the edges. I thought you looked familiar," he said, letting out an awkward chuckle. "Didn't realize I was in the presence of Florida royalty." Pam didn't react. She didn't turn. She didn't speak. She just continued reading, as if he were nothing more than background noise. Nathan's stomach twisted. She had heard every word. And yet, she didn't even acknowledge him. And somehow, that was worse than anything she could have said. She had heard every word, registered every comment, and she had decided he wasn't even worth the effort. That was worse, so much worse, than if she had called him out. If she had turned and fired back, at least he could have argued. He could have played it off, made a joke, done something, but this was deliberate. She had made a choice. To let him drown in his own embarrassment. Nathan shifted in his seat, pretending to adjust his seatbelt, scrambling for something, anything, to smooth things over. I actually followed some of your cases back in the day," he tried, forcing a light tone. "You've had quite the career." Nothing. No glance. No acknowledgement. Nathan's skin prickled. He exhaled, rubbing his jaw, suddenly hyper-aware of just how long this flight still had to go. It was one thing to feel embarrassed for a few minutes. It was another to be trapped at 35,000 feet with no escape. forced to sit in the discomfort he had created for himself. And just when he thought it couldn't get worse, the flight attendant returned. "Another drink, sir?" Nathan opened his mouth, hesitated. For some reason, the thought of another scotch didn't sit right. "Just water," he muttered. The flight attendant nodded, taking his empty glass. And that's when he saw it. The tiniest flicker of amusement in Pam Bondi's eyes. She still didn't look at him, still didn't acknowledge him, but in that split second he knew. She had been watching. She had been waiting. And now, she was enjoying every second of his discomfort. For the first time in a long time, Nathan Kessler understood exactly what it felt like to be small. He sat rigidly in his seat, the weight of his own words pressing down on him like an anvil. How had he let this happen? He was usually good at reading people, at controlling conversations, at making sure he never ended up looking like the fool. And yet here he was, trapped in his own arrogance, staring at the back of a woman's head who had dismantled him, without saying a single word. His mind scrambled for an exit strategy. Should he apologize? Make a joke? Pretend none of it happened? He risked a glance at the other passengers, subtly gauging the damage. The businessman across the aisle wasn't looking at him anymore, but the slight smirk on his lips said everything. The flight attendant was more professional about it, offering him only a neutral glance as she set down his water. Nathan cleared his throat. "Thanks." She nodded and moved on. And somehow that was worse. She didn't pity him. She didn't care. He wasn't even important enough to care about. Nathan's gaze flicked back to Pam, but she was still reading. Still unfazed. Still carrying herself like someone who had already moved on. And maybe that was what stung the most. She wasn't angry. She wasn't waiting for an apology. She had heard every word, registered every comment. And she had decided he wasn't even worth the effort. That was worse, so much worse, than if she had called him out. If she had turned and fired back, at least he could have argued. He could have played it off, made a joke, done something. But this was deliberate. She had made a choice, to let him drown in his own embarrassment. Nathan shifted in his seat, pretending to adjust his seatbelt, scrambling for something, anything to smooth things over. I actually followed some of your cases back in the day," he tried, forcing a light tone. "You've had quite the career." Nothing. No glance. No acknowledgement. Nathan's skin prickled. He exhaled, rubbing his jaw, suddenly hyper-aware of just how long this flight still had to go. It was one thing to feel embarrassed for a few minutes. It was another, to be trapped at 35,000 feet with no escape, forced to sit in the discomfort he had created for himself. And just when he thought it couldn't get worse, the flight attendant returned. "Another drink, sir?" Nathan opened his mouth, hesitated. For some reason, the thought of another scotch didn't sit right. "Just water," he muttered. The flight attendant nodded, taking his empty glass. And that's when he saw it. The tiniest flicker of amusement in Pam Bondi's eyes. She still didn't look at him, still didn't acknowledge him, but in that split second he knew. She had been watching, she had been waiting, and now she was enjoying every second of his discomfort. For the first time in a long time, Nathan Kessler understood exactly what it felt like to be small. He sat rigidly in his seat, the weight of his own words pressing down on him like an anvil. How had he let this happen? He was usually good at reading people, at controlling conversations, at making sure he never ended up looking like the fool. And yet here he was, trapped in his own arrogance, staring at the back of a woman's head who had dismantled him, without saying a single word. His mind scrambled for an exit strategy. Should he apologize, make a joke, pretend none of it happened? He risked a glance at the other passengers, subtly gauging the damage. The businessman across the aisle wasn't looking at him anymore, but the slight smirk on his lips said everything. The flight attendant was more professional about it, offering him only a neutral glance as she set down his water. Nathan cleared his throat. "Thanks." She nodded and moved on, and somehow that was worse. She didn't pity him. She didn't care. He wasn't even important enough to care about. Nathan's gaze flicked back to Pam, but she was still reading. Still unfazed. Still carrying herself like someone who had already moved on. And maybe that was what stung the most. She wasn't angry. She wasn't waiting for an apology. She had decided he wasn't worth a second thought. Nathan hated that feeling, and it was his own fault. His fingers tapped restlessly against the tray table, agitated. He thought about the stories he'd read about her legal battles, her high-profile cases, the people who had tried to intimidate her and failed. And he, like an idiot, had assumed she would care about his opinion. Nathan exhaled slowly. Maybe it was the altitude. Maybe it was the fact that he had nowhere to go. But for the first time in a long time, he started thinking about the kind of person he had become. He had spent years walking into rooms like he owned them, speaking like his words carried more weight than anyone else's, assuming his version of reality was the only one that mattered. But here, right here in this moment, he wasn't the powerful one. He wasn't the one with control, and he didn't like how that felt. The plane hummed softly around him, the cabin settling into quiet conversation and the occasional clink of glasses. Nathan picked up his water and took a sip, staring blankly at the seat in front of him. Maybe this was the kind of lesson people like him didn't learn until they had no choice. Maybe this was exactly what he deserved. He turned to the window, watching the sky stretch endlessly beyond the wing. And for the first time, the vastness of it made him feel small, insignificant. It was a foreign feeling, one he wasn't sure he liked. For years, he had carried himself like the center of the universe. People laughed at his jokes even when they weren't funny. They nodded along when he spoke, even when he had nothing of value to say. He was used to commanding attention, but today, he had been reminded of something he had long forgotten. Respect wasn't about money. It wasn't about power. It wasn't about being the loudest voice in the room. It was about character. Pam Bondi hadn't needed to put him in his place because she didn't have to. She had let his own arrogance do the job for her. Nathan took another sip of water, letting the coolness settle in his throat. It wasn't scotch, but maybe that was for the best. For once, he needed to sit with his thoughts without drowning them in alcohol. He glanced at her again, half expecting her to finally turn to throw him a glance of satisfaction. But she didn't. She was done with him. She had been done with him the moment she realized what kind of man he was. That realization twisted in his chest. It wasn't often that someone like him had to face himself, had to sit in the discomfort of knowing he had been the fool in the room. Nathan sighed, rubbing his temple. Maybe it was time he started listening more and talking less. Maybe it was time he started thinking before assuming he knew everything. The flight attendant passed by again, but for the first time, Nathan didn't wave her down for another drink. Instead, he sat quietly, watching the sky as the plane began its descent into Tampa. And he realized something. This wasn't about Pam Bondi. This was about the kind of man he wanted to be from here on out. How often do we judge people before we even know who they are? How many times have we let arrogance blind us to the truth? Maybe the real lesson isn't about power or status. Maybe it's about learning to treat people with respect before we regret it. If this story made you think, hit that subscribe button. Who knows? Maybe next time you'll catch yourself before making the same mistake.